I've been a paramedic for almost 10 years, and in that time, I've seen my fair share of chaos, heartbreak, and miracles. But there's one call I'll never forget, one that still wakes me up in a cold sweat. I've told myself for years that it's all explainable, that nothing out of the ordinary happened that night. But the truth is, I don't know what to believe anymore. It was a double shift kind of night, the kind where your bones ache and your brain feels foggy from too much caffeine and too little sleep. I was working with my partner, Claire, who'd been on the job even longer than me. She was tough as nails, the kind of person who could deliver bad news to a family with compassion and still crack a joke to keep the team spirits up. Around 11 p.m., just as we were hoping for a quiet stretch, the radio crackled to life. Dispatch to Unit 47. Respond to a 10 to 54, possible 10 to 55, single vehicle off-road. No additional units available at this time. Car accident. And given the codes, it sounded like the driver might be deceased or intoxicated. Claire groaned, but we both knew there was no passing the call. The location was about 20 miles out of town, near the old highway that cut through the woods. It was a desolate stretch of road, barely lit, surrounded by trees that seemed to swallow the light from our ambulance's high beams. As we approached the coordinates, we spotted the wreck. A dark sedan had veered off the road, crashing into a massive oak tree. The front end was crumpled like an accordion, and the windshield was a spiderweb of shattered glass. Claire and I grabbed our gear and approached cautiously. The driver's side door was open, but there was no sign of anyone inside. "Hello? EMS, is anyone here?" Claire called out, her voice echoing into the still night. No response. We checked around the car, shining our flashlights into the dense underbrush. That's when I saw the blood, a trail leading away from the car, disappearing into the woods. "We've got a runner," I said, nodding toward the blood. Claire sighed. "Great, probably drunk and panicked. Let's go." We followed the trail, moving slowly. The woods were eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. Every snap of a twig underfoot sounded like a gunshot. About 100 yards in, we found him. A man, late 30s, slumped against a tree. He was conscious but dazed, his face pale and his breathing shallow. "Sir, can you hear me? I'm a paramedic. We're here to help," I said, kneeling beside him. His eyes flicked toward me, but he didn't speak. His hands were trembling, clutching something tightly against his chest. "Claire, let's get the stretcher," I said over my shoulder. As she turned to head back to the ambulance, the man suddenly grabbed my wrist. His grip was surprisingly strong. "They're still out there," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "What? Who's out there?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "They didn't see me, but they'll see you. You have to go," he said, his eyes wide with terror. I tried to reassure him, chalking it up to shock or a head injury. But the look in his eyes was so raw, so genuine, it made my stomach churn. Claire returned with the stretcher, and together we loaded him onto it. He didn't resist, but he kept glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting something to emerge from the darkness. We got him back to the ambulance and began the drive to the nearest hospital, which was a good 40 minutes away. I sat in the back with him, monitoring his vitals. "What happened out there?" I asked, trying to keep him talking. "They were in the road," he said after a long pause. "I thought they were hitchhikers, but when I got closer, they weren't right. Their faces." His voice trailed off and he shuddered. I didn't press him for more. People say strange things when they're injured or in shock. About 10 minutes into the drive, the ambulance suddenly jolted, like we'd hit something. "What was that?" Claire shouted from the driver's seat. I peeked out the back window but saw nothing but the empty road behind us. "Probably an animal," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. The patient started to panic, thrashing on the stretcher. "You have to keep driving. Don't stop. Don't let them catch us." "Calm down, sir," I said, trying to restrain him. "You're safe now." But his fear was contagious. I found myself glancing at the dark woods outside, half expecting to see something moving between the trees. We made it to the hospital without further incident, but the man's words stayed with me. After we handed him off to the ER staff, I asked the admitting nurse if they could keep me updated on his condition. She gave me a strange look. "What man?" she asked. "The guy we just brought in. From the car accident," I said. She frowned, flipping through her clipboard. "You're the only ambulance that's come in tonight." I laughed, thinking it was some kind of mix-up. "Check again. We brought him in maybe 5 minutes ago." She shook her head. "I don't have anyone matching that description. Are you sure you weren't dispatched to another hospital?" My blood ran cold. I turned to Claire, who was standing behind me, her face pale. "I watched them wheel him into the ER," she said, her voice shaking. We spent the next hour searching the hospital, questioning staff, and reviewing security footage. There was no trace of him, no record of a patient being admitted, no sign of him on the tapes. The ambulance logs confirmed we had responded to a call, but the dispatcher couldn't explain why there was no record of the caller or the crash site. Claire and I didn't talk much on the ride back to the station. Neither of us wanted to admit what we were thinking. I've tried to rationalize it over the years, telling myself it was a paperwork error or a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But every so often, I dream about that night. The man's terrified eyes, the jolt of the ambulance, the silence of the woods. And sometimes, when I'm driving home late at night, I think I see someone standing by the side of the road, their face hidden in the shadows. I never considered myself superstitious. Ghost stories and urban legends were things I dismissed as entertainment, nothing more. That changed last summer, when I spent 3 months in the small, isolated town of Kessler, helping my friend Jake renovate an old house. Kessler wasn't much of a town, just a few businesses along a short main street, surrounded by farmland and dense woods that seemed to stretch endlessly. Jake's house was on the edge of town, near Kessler Creek. The property itself was unremarkable, just an aging farmhouse that hadn't seen proper maintenance in years. Jake had picked it up cheap, confident he could flip it for a decent profit once it was fixed up. I agreed to help him with the project. The work was straightforward but exhausting. Repairing walls, replacing sagging floorboards, fixing a plumbing system that was older than either of us. We spent long days working and evenings unwinding on the porch, enjoying the quiet and the sound of crickets. One evening, as we were finishing up for the day, Jake mentioned the bridge by the creek. He said it was called the Devil's Crossing, a place locals avoided after dark. Supposedly, strange things happened if you lingered on the bridge at night. Whispers, shadows, even people disappearing. I laughed it off, but Jake seemed serious, saying the town had a long history of strange stories tied to that spot. I didn't think much of it at the time, chalking it up to small-town folklore. But over the next few days, I noticed something odd. Whenever the creek or the bridge came up in conversation, the locals became uncomfortable. They avoided answering questions directly, or they gave vague warnings about staying away. At the hardware store, one older man told me bluntly, "Nothing good happens near that bridge. Best leave it be." The unease grew when Jake's golden retriever, Max, disappeared into the woods one evening. Max loved roaming around while we worked, but he always came back after a few minutes. This time, he didn't. Jake and I searched the woods for hours, calling his name and shining flashlights into the trees. We found him near the creek, standing rigid and staring at the bridge. When we called him, he didn't move. We had to walk up and physically lead him away, and even then, he was shaking. That night, he refused to leave the house and spent hours pacing nervously. A few days later, Jake left town for a weekend to visit family. I stayed behind to continue working. The first night alone was uneventful, but on the second, I woke to a faint knocking sound. It wasn't coming from the front door or any of the windows. It was distant and rhythmic, like someone tapping wood. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto the porch. The sound stopped. The woods were still and dark, and I was about to go back inside when something glinted near the tree line. I walked toward it and found an old, rusted key lying in the dirt. The metal was worn, the kind of antique you might find in a museum or buried in a time capsule. I picked it up, and as soon as I did, the knocking started again, louder this time. The sound came from the direction of the creek. I felt a pull to follow it, though I couldn't explain why. My heart was pounding, but curiosity drove me forward. The woods were unnervingly silent as I made my way toward the creek. When I reached it, the sound stopped again. The bridge loomed ahead, its wooden planks weathered and uneven. The air felt heavy, and I was overwhelmed by an unshakable feeling that I wasn't alone. I shone my flashlight across the bridge, seeing nothing but the faint mist rising from the water. Then, at the far end of the bridge, a figure appeared. It was just a silhouette, tall and motionless. I froze, unsure of what to do. "Hello," I called out. My voice sounded thin and weak in the stillness. The figure didn't respond. I took a step closer, and as I did, it vanished. Not faded or walked away, just disappeared. I turned and ran back to the house, locking the doors behind me. I stayed up the rest of the night, every light in the house blazing, replaying the moment over and over in my mind. When Jake returned the next day, I told him what had happened. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he just nodded. He said there was something wrong with that bridge, that even as a kid, he'd felt uneasy about it. We finished the renovations a few weeks later. Jake sold the house to a young couple who seemed thrilled to get such a deal. I didn't mention the bridge or anything that had happened. I figured they wouldn't believe me, and besides, I wanted to leave Kessler and its strange stories behind. I haven't been back since, but sometimes, late at night, I think about that bridge. I wonder if I imagined it all, if it was just exhaustion or stress playing tricks on me. But then I remember the figure on the bridge, the way it disappeared, and the feeling of being watched. Some places, I've learned, carry a weight you can't explain, and some things are better left unexplored. There are some decisions you make in life that seem harmless at the time, just simple, split-second choices. But sometimes, those choices lead to consequences you never see coming. It happened last spring. I was driving back to Chicago from a work trip in a small town in southern Illinois. I had left later than I planned, and by the time I hit the interstate, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting everything in shades of orange and purple. I was tired, but the thought of sleeping in my own bed kept me going. Traffic was light, and the hum of the engine was almost soothing. I was about an hour outside the city when I saw him, a man standing on the shoulder of the road, his thumb outstretched. I know what you're thinking, don't pick up hitchhikers. I've seen enough movies and read enough headlines to know better. But something about this guy seemed unthreatening. He was middle-aged, wearing a windbreaker and jeans, with a duffel bag slung over one shoulder. He didn't look dangerous, just tired. I slowed down and pulled onto the shoulder a few yards ahead of him. As he jogged up to the car, I rolled down the window a crack. "Where you headed?" I asked. "North," he said, his voice rough but polite. "Anywhere close to the city would be great." I hesitated for a moment but nodded. "All right, hop in." He climbed into the passenger seat, setting his bag on the floor. "Thanks," he said. "Not many people would stop." I shrugged, trying to play it cool. "It's no big deal. Just don't murder me. Okay?" He laughed, a short, dry laugh. "No promises," he said, though his tone was light. We drove in silence for a while. I glanced at him now and then, taking in the way his hands rested on his knees, how his eyes scanned the darkening road ahead. He seemed tense, like he was carrying the weight of something heavy. "You from around here?" I asked, breaking the quiet. Used to be, he said. Moved away a while ago. Just trying to get back, I guess. His answer was vague, but I didn't push. Everyone has their reasons for where they're going and why. About 30 minutes into the drive, I started to notice little things. The way he kept shifting in his seat like he couldn't get comfortable. The way his eyes flicked to the side mirror every so often, as if he was expecting to see something or someone following us. You okay? I asked, keeping my tone casual. Yeah, he said quickly. Just a little paranoid, I guess. Long day. I nodded, though his answer didn't sit right with me. A few miles later, he asked me to pull over at a gas station. He said he needed to use the restroom and I was happy to take a break. As soon as I stopped, he grabbed his bag and stepped out of the car. I watched him walk into the gas station, debating whether I should just drive off. Something about him was unsettling, but I couldn't put my finger on it. He hadn't done anything threatening. Maybe it was just my own nerves getting the better of me. A few minutes later, he came back, a bottled water in one hand and his bag slung over his shoulder. Thanks for waiting, he said as he climbed back in. We hit the road again, the gas station's lights fading in the rearview mirror. It wasn't until we were back on the interstate that I noticed something odd. The duffel bag. When he got back into the car, it looked fuller than it had when he left. Did you buy something? I asked, glancing at the bag. He froze for a moment, just a split second, before relaxing again. Yeah, just some snacks. His answer didn't make sense. The bag wasn't the kind you'd use for groceries, and it didn't look like it held snacks. I didn't say anything else, but my grip on the steering wheel tightened. I kept my eyes on the road, my mind racing with possibilities. A few miles later, he asked me to take an exit onto a smaller road. It's a shortcut, he said. I hesitated but complied, turning off the interstate onto a dark, narrow stretch of highway. Trees lined both sides, their branches arching overhead. How much farther? I asked after a few minutes. Not far, he said, but his voice sounded different now, more clipped, less casual. The unease that had been simmering inside me boiled over. I needed an excuse to pull over, something to get him out of the car. Actually, I think I missed a turn, I said. Let me check my GPS. I slowed down and pulled onto the shoulder. The road was pitch black, no other cars in sight. Don't worry about it, he said quickly, his voice sharper now. Just keep going. I'll tell you where to turn. My heart was pounding. I reached for my phone, pretending to open the map app. That's when I saw it. The bag at his feet was partially unzipped, and sticking out of it was a knife. Not a pocket knife, but a full-blown hunting knife. I didn't think. I just acted. I need to step out for a second, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Stretch my legs. Before he could respond, I opened the door and stepped out. The cool night air hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop. I slammed the door shut and started walking, keeping my pace brisk but not panicked. Hey! He called after me, his voice laced with confusion. What are you doing? I didn't answer. I just kept walking, pretending to be looking at my phone. As soon as I was a few yards away, I broke into a sprint, running down the road as fast as I could. Behind me, I heard the car door open, then footsteps. Come back, he shouted, his voice angry now. What the hell are you doing? I didn't look back. Up ahead, I saw headlights, another car coming down the road. I ran into the middle of the lane, waving my arms like a madman. The car screeched to a halt and the driver, a middle-aged woman, rolled down her window. Are you okay? She asked, her eyes wide with concern. Please, I gasped. I need help. Call the police. Behind me, the footsteps stopped. I turned to see the man standing in the shadows, his face obscured. He didn't say anything, didn't move. The woman grabbed her phone, dialing 911 as I climbed into her car. When the police arrived, the man was gone. They searched the area but found nothing. No trace of him, no sign of his bag. I gave my statement and went home, shaken but unharmed. To this day, I don't know what his intentions were. Maybe he was harmless, just a guy with a knife in his bag. But I can't shake the feeling that I avoided something terrible that night. And I'll never pick up a hitchhiker again. I always knew the late shifts at the gas station could be dangerous. We're off a rural highway, the kind of place where truckers and the occasional drifter stop for coffee or fuel. Most nights, it's uneventful. A few regulars, the hum of fluorescent lights, and hours of scrolling through my phone to pass the time. But last night was different. Last night, I learned just how quickly a quiet night can spiral into something terrifying. It was around 11:30 p.m. when he walked in. A man in his 40s, maybe older, wearing a faded baseball cap pulled low over his face. He was dressed like a construction worker. Dusty jeans, steel-toed boots, and a jacket that looked like it had seen better days. At first, I didn't think much of him. We get all kinds out here. "Evening," I said, keeping my tone friendly but not too eager. He didn't respond, just gave a curt nod and headed for the back of the store where the drinks were. I went back to stocking the cigarettes behind the counter, but something about him nagged at me. Maybe it was the way he walked, slow and deliberate, like he was taking his time even though there wasn't much to see in our tiny store. Or maybe it was the fact that he didn't look at any of the shelves, just wandered aimlessly. After a few minutes, he came up to the counter with a single bottle of water. I rang him up, gave him his change, and he left without a word. That should have been the end of it. About 20 minutes later, I saw headlights pull back into the lot. I glanced up at the security monitor and recognized his truck. A beat-up old Ford with a rusted bumper. He parked near the edge of the lot, not at the pump, and didn't get out right away. He just sat there. I felt a prickle of unease. It wasn't unusual for people to hang around for a bit, truckers taking a break or locals using the Wi-Fi. But something about him sitting there, in the dark, made me uneasy. I told myself to ignore it. People are weird. That doesn't make them dangerous. Another 10 minutes passed, and he still hadn't moved. I couldn't help but keep glancing at the monitor, watching the faint glow of his headlights in the distance. Then the door chimed, and he was back. This time, he didn't browse. He walked straight up to the counter, his boots heavy on the tile floor. "Bathroom key," he said gruffly, his voice low and rough. I handed him the key attached to the oversized plastic tag, trying to act casual. "It's around the side of the building." He didn't thank me, just took the key and left. I exhaled slowly, my nerves on edge. I didn't like how he avoided eye contact or how he loitered in his truck for so long before coming back. But again, I told myself I was overreacting. People can be odd, especially late at night. A few minutes later, I heard the chime again. He was back, holding the key. "Thanks," he muttered, tossing it onto the counter. I watched him leave and get back in his truck. But instead of driving off, he stayed parked in the lot. By now, I was actively uncomfortable. I locked the front doors, a rule we're technically not supposed to enforce unless there's an active threat. For the next 20 minutes, I tried to distract myself with inventory, but I couldn't stop glancing at the monitor. He was still there, his truck idling in the shadows. And then, just as suddenly as he came, he drove off. I felt relief wash over me, but it was short-lived. A few minutes later, I saw another vehicle pull into the lot. This one was different, an older sedan with no plates. My stomach twisted when I saw the man from before get out of the passenger side. He wasn't alone anymore. The second man was taller, bulkier, and wore a hoodie that obscured his face. Together, they walked toward the store. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, keeping my voice low. "Hi, I'm at the Parkside gas station off Route 22, I whispered. "There are two men outside, acting suspicious. I think they might try to rob me. The operator asked me to stay on the line, but I hung up when I saw the taller man tug at the locked door. He rattled it hard, then pounded on the glass. "Hey, open up," he shouted. I stayed behind the counter, my heart hammering. "We're closed," I yelled back. The first man, the one in the cap, leaned closer to the glass. "Come on, we just want to buy something. Don't make this difficult." I didn't respond. My hand hovered over the panic button under the counter, but I hesitated. What if I was wrong? What if they really did just want to buy something? But then I saw the taller man pull something out of his pocket. At first, I thought it was a knife, but the glint of metal told me it was a crowbar. He swung it against the glass door, and the sound was deafening. I hit the panic button and ducked behind the counter, my hands trembling. The glass didn't shatter completely, but it cracked under the force of the blow. "We know you're in there," the man shouted. I heard sirens in the distance, faint but growing louder. The men must have heard them too because the pounding stopped abruptly. I peeked over the counter and saw them sprinting back to the sedan. They tore out of the lot just as the first police cruiser pulled in. I unlocked the door and ran outside, waving frantically. "They just left," I shouted. "They went that way." The officers took off after them, but I never found out if they caught them. All I know is that by the time I finished giving my statement and the glass was boarded up, the sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. I quit the gas station the next day. It was the kind of evening that made you want to stay inside. The sky was thick with dark clouds, and a sharp wind made the trees sway ominously. The small town of Brackenwood was quiet, too quiet for my liking. I had just moved here 3 weeks ago to escape the noise of the city and find some peace. I figured a small, sleepy town would offer that much-needed escape. What I didn't realize, though, was that Brackenwood had its own secrets. I'm a reporter by trade, which means I have a natural curiosity, sometimes to my own detriment. The first thing I noticed about the town was its eerie stillness. People didn't seem to talk much to outsiders, and there was a constant undercurrent of something unspoken between them. One night, after finishing up an article for the local paper, I decided to take a walk through the town to clear my head. As I strolled down Elm Street, I passed by the old gable house, a massive, dilapidated structure that had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember. The place was infamous in town for its dark history. Whispers of mysterious disappearances and strange noises coming from inside had surrounded it for years. I had heard the rumors, of course, but nothing ever seemed to come of them. Curiosity got the better of me, and I found myself standing in front of the house, staring at its boarded-up windows. Then I saw it. A light flickered in one of the windows on the second floor. My first instinct was to walk away, but something stopped me. The door was ajar slightly, as if inviting me in. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should call someone. But then I thought, what if I found something? Something that could explain all the strange talk around this house? So I stepped inside. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I made my way through the dusty hallway. The air was thick with the scent of mold and decay. Everything about the house screamed neglect, but there was also a sense of something more, an ominous presence that seemed to linger in the air. I walked past old, rotting furniture and faded wallpaper until I reached the staircase. I could still see the flickering light coming from the second floor. Against my better judgment, I climbed the stairs. At the top of the stairs, I turned left into a dark hallway. There was a room at the end of the corridor where the light seemed to be coming from. I moved toward it cautiously, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the silence. When I reached the door, I pushed it open slowly, my heart racing. Inside, there was a single chair in the center of the room, facing a window that looked out over the town. But what really caught my attention was the figure sitting in the chair. A woman, her back to me, staring out of the window. "Hello," I called, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet of the room. The woman didn't move. I stepped forward, my curiosity pushing me to approach her, though every instinct in me told me to leave. I was about to say something when I heard it, a soft sound, almost like a whisper. It was so faint that I wasn't sure if I imagined it. But then I heard it again. A voice. "Don't go any further," the voice said, chilling me to the bone. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. The woman hadn't moved. She hadn't said anything, but the voice had come from her. I had no idea where it was coming from, but it was unmistakable. I backed away slowly, but my foot caught on something, and I stumbled. The chair shifted, and for the first time, the woman moved. Slowly, she turned her head to look at me. Her face was pale, gaunt, as though she hadn't seen sunlight in years. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, staring at me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. She didn't speak, didn't make a sound. She simply watched me, her eyes never leaving mine. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized she wasn't just looking at me. She was watching me, as if she knew I was going to be there. The unease that had settled in my stomach intensified. I turned and bolted out of the room, down the stairs, and out of the house as quickly as I could. When I reached the front door, I looked back one last time, my heart still racing. The light had gone out. But then, as I glanced up at the window where I had seen the woman, my blood ran cold. There was someone standing in the window watching me. It was the same woman, but now she was standing in the window, her face pressed against the glass. She had followed me. Somehow, she had moved faster than I could have imagined. I ran back to my apartment and locked the door behind me. I couldn't shake the image of her staring at me from the window. I tried to tell myself that it was just my imagination, that I had been spooked by the old house, but I couldn't forget her eyes, the way they had followed me. The next morning, I went back to the gable house. I wasn't sure why, but I felt compelled to go back. When I reached the front door, I found it wide open, just as I had left it. I stepped inside, but the house was eerily silent. I walked through the rooms, but there was no sign of the woman. There was no light, no sign of movement, nothing. It was as if she had never been there. I left the house, my nerves on edge, but as I walked back down the street, I couldn't help but notice something strange. The house across the street from Gable House had a window that overlooked the old mansion. And through that window, someone was watching me. The woman. Her eyes were fixed on me, unblinking, and I realized with a sinking feeling that I had never truly left.